The first thing I want to tell you is that I smelled it before I saw it. I know that sounds like a strange way to start, but if you've spent enough time in the backcountry, really in it, not camping in a designated site with a bear box and a composting toilet, you learn that smell does more work than your eyes do. Your eyes point forward. Smell comes from everywhere. I'd been a wildlife photographer for 12 years at that point, and I'd trained myself to pay attention to it the same way I paid attention to light. What's in the air right now? What changed? What wasn't here 10 minutes ago? So when I pushed into that cave for the first time in 3 years, backpack cutting into my shoulders, headlamp throwing a pale cone ahead of me, I knew within about 20 feet that something had died in there recently. I almost turned around. I really did. I stood there with one hand on the cave wall, the rock cold and damp under my palm, and I thought about going back down the trail to my truck, sleeping in the truck, figuring something else out. But it was October, and the temperature had already dropped into the low 30s at night, and I'd driven past the junction at the base of the mountain on my way up, and seen what was happening down there. Seen enough of it anyway. A pickup on its side in the ditch. Someone running on the shoulder of the highway who didn't run like a person in a hurry runs. They ran like they'd forgotten how their body worked. 2 cars stopped nose to nose across the lanes with nobody in or around them, just sitting there with their doors open. I'd kept driving, kept going up, so I didn't turn around. I went deeper into the cave. Found him about 60 feet in, just past the first bend where the passage opens up into the wider chamber. He was in the corner, half sitting against the wall with his knees pulled up. A man, I guessed mid-40s, in the kind of hiking gear that costs money, the good rain pants, a merino wool base layer still visible under his open jacket. His pack was still on his back. He'd been there long enough that he wasn't really recognizable as a person anymore, if you understand what I mean. The cold had done some work to slow things down, and it was dark, and I didn't look longer than I had to. What I noticed, what my brain recorded the way it records images, clinical and flat and then emotional later, was that his hands were in front of him on the rock floor. Palms down, fingers spread, like he'd sat down there and pressed his hands flat on the ground and then just stopped. I'd like to think he was resting. I think he was probably trying to get himself up one more time and couldn't. There was a deep bite wound on the back of his right hand. Even in bad light, even weeks after the fact, I could tell what it was. The shape of it. Teeth have a specific geometry. I backed out of the cave slowly. Didn't run. When you're in the backcountry and you find something dead, and you don't know what killed it, you don't run. Running creates noise and movement. I went to the entrance, sat on the rock ledge outside, and looked down at the valley for a long time. The town below, Kettrick, about 4,000 people, the kind of place that has 1 hardware store, 2 diners, a Walgreens, and a mountain equipment rental shop that stays open from May to October, was producing more smoke than it should have been. Not wildfire smoke, wrong color, wrong pattern. Several separate columns from different points, like someone had lit fires on a street grid. It was the 3rd of October. I sat there for probably an hour, watched the smoke, watched the road that wound up the mountain from town. Nothing moving on it. That was actually more worrying than if I'd seen a car. The road should have had people on it by now, evacuating or running toward the mountain because the mountain felt safer than town, or just panicking in the general direction of less people. Nothing on it meant either the road was blocked, or nobody left down there was capable of choosing a direction. Here's what I knew, or thought I knew, at that point. I'd been up in the backcountry for 4 days before this, shooting a project I'd been planning since spring. Migration patterns of mule deer through a particular high-elevation corridor about 8 miles north of the cave. When you're that far out, you're off the grid by choice. No signal, no radio, just your work and the mountain. I came back into partial signal range on the 2nd, picked up a bunch of news alerts on my phone in a jumbled rush, read about a 5th of them before the signal dropped again, and what I gathered was bad, but also confusing. Reports of attacks in Portland and Salem. Something about a hospital in Eugene being locked down. The phrases they use, aggressive behavior, and rapidly spreading, and authorities urge residents to shelter in place, which could mean a lot of things, and I'd told myself it probably meant something less than what it sounded like, because it always means less than it sounds like. Then I drove back down to the trailhead parking area the following morning, and I saw the car with the smashed windshield. Someone had gone through it from the inside. The airbag had deployed. There was blood on the seat and on the outside of the driver's door, like something had spilled out of it when the door opened. The car was empty. I sat in my truck next to it for about 15 minutes, reading what I could pull up on my phone on half a bar of signal. What I read was enough. I grabbed my serious pack from behind the seat, the one I take on multi-week shoots that has the water filter and the first aid kit and the emergency shelter, and I added everything else I had in the truck that seemed useful. 3 days of food, 2 extra headlamps, a fixed-blade knife I'd carried for years, a small hatchet, a half-used roll of paracord, a Nalgene, and then I drove back up to the higher trailhead and hiked into the cave, where I found the dead hiker. So when I walked back out and sat on that ledge and looked down at the smoke from Kettrick, I was working through the very specific problem of what to do next. There were a lot of options, and none of them were good, and one of them was to go back inside the cave with the dead man and figure out how to make it work anyway. I chose that one. I went back in. I moved him. I don't want to say a lot about that, because it doesn't help anything to describe it in detail, and it's not the kind of thing I want to spend words on. What I'll say is that the second chamber, the one about 40 feet past the first, accessed through a crawl space that's maybe 3 feet high and 4 feet wide, was empty, and that's where I moved him. I pulled his pack off first and set it aside. I'd look through it later. Then I moved him as gently as I could manage, which wasn't very gently because of the condition he was in, and I put him in the second chamber, and I said something out loud. I don't even remember what. And then I came back through the crawl space, and I sat in the main chamber in the dark, and I didn't do anything for a while. His name was Gerald Poole. I know that because of his pack. He had a camelback with a luggage tag on it, the kind of weatherproof tag you attach to gear when you're worried about losing it at a trailhead, and it had his name and a phone number on it. He had a trail map in the top pocket, folded and creased, with a route marked in pencil that started at the lower trailhead and went up a loop I recognized but never used much. He'd planned 3 days. His food bag had about 1 day of supplies left in it, which meant he'd been out there longer than planned before he ended up here. In the main food pocket of his pack, I found a Ziploc bag with 4 granola bars, a package of instant oatmeal, 2 packets of instant coffee, a handful of almonds in a smaller bag, and a vacuum-sealed foil pouch of pre-cooked rice. I added all of it to my own food. That sounds bad. I know it sounds bad. But he didn't need it anymore, and I did, so that's what happened. His sleeping bag was a 3-season mummy bag, good to about 20 degrees, which was actually better than the synthetic bag I had. I kept that too. His water filter was a different brand than mine, but worked the same way. I set it aside to use as a backup. He had a first aid kit that was better stocked than mine. He had a headlamp with fresh batteries. He had a lighter and a small butane camp stove, and 2 fuel canisters that were maybe a third full each. He had a silver emergency blanket still in the wrapper. And he had a small notebook and a pen. The notebook had some hiking notes in it, elevation gains, distances, times, in handwriting that was precise and small. The last entry was dated September 28th, or staying in cave tonight. There were no entries after that. That was 5 days before I arrived. I closed the notebook and put it back in his pack, and left the pack in the second chamber with him. I don't know why. It felt wrong to bring it all the way out, like taking his wallet. I took the supplies I needed, and that was already more than I was comfortable with, honestly. Then I went back outside, and I looked down at the valley again, and I watched the smoke for another hour, and I started making a list in my head of what I needed to do. Funny thing about being a wildlife photographer, people think the job is about being in dramatic situations, about chasing the shot, about the climactic moment, and sometimes it is. But most of it, the actual work of it, the reason I was reasonably good at it, is patience and planning. Knowing what you need before you need it. Spending 3 days reading the land, before you ever touch the camera. Understanding that the image you want won't happen on your timeline, and the only thing you can control is your preparation for when it does. I'm telling you this because it matters for what comes next. I'm not a soldier. I'm not a prepper. I didn't have a bug-out plan. I didn't have a bunker. And I didn't have a year's worth of freeze-dried food. And I definitely didn't have a rifle. I had a wildlife photographer's understanding of outdoor survival, which is different from military-grade anything, but it's also not nothing. I knew how to read weather. I knew which plants were edible and which weren't. I knew how to stay quiet for very long periods. I knew how to observe without being observed. Those things ended up being worth more than a rifle, most days. The first thing I did was go back down to my truck. I want to be clear about the timing here, because it matters. It was still October 3rd, the afternoon, probably 2:30 or 3. I had maybe 5 hours of daylight. I hiked down from the cave to the trailhead in about 45 minutes, which is fast for that trail, but I was moving with purpose. My truck was still where I'd left it, a 4-year-old Tacoma with a bed cap, the thing I'd been using as a mobile studio for the last 6 years. I opened the tailgate and spent about 20 minutes going through everything I had. Photography equipment, 2 camera bodies, 5 lenses, including a 600mm telephoto that I'd paid more for than I'd paid for my first car, and used more than any other single object I owned, 3 lens filters, 2 tripods, 1 carbon fiber travel tripod, and 1 heavy-duty one I mostly used for video, a shoulder bag and 2 Pelican cases for the cameras, battery chargers, batteries, 2 extra battery grips, cables, 3 32-gig memory cards, and a portable hard drive. I took all of it. I want to make sure you understand that. The lenses especially, the 600mm. People would say that was a strange priority when you're packing for a survival situation. I'd say those people have never spent 12 years building a tool set that lets them see things at a distance that no human can see without it. That telephoto lens was going to be my eyes for the next 100 days. Best decision I made in those first hours. Other stuff in the truck, a small toolkit, pliers, flathead and Phillips screwdrivers, a crescent wrench, a utility knife, duct tape, a camping propane stove that runs off the small green cylinders, and about 8 cylinders, 2 5-gallon water jugs, empty, a tarp, rope, about 50 feet, 2 wool blankets, an old pair of rubber boots, a fleece jacket that had been living behind the seat for 2 years, a box of garbage bags, 3 plastic bins I used for organizing gear, a road atlas of the state, a small cooler. In the cab, a CB radio that I'd barely used in 5 years, a phone charger, a hand-crank emergency radio still in the box from when I bought it at a gas station after a bad storm 3 winters ago and never opened, 2 protein bars in the center console, a disposable lighter, half a pack of ibuprofen. I pulled everything out of the truck, sorted it, started loading the most important stuff into the bins for carrying, made 2 piles, the things I was taking right now on this trip and the things I was coming back for. Here's where it gets to the part I'm not proud of. There was a house about a 1/4 mile down the mountain road from the trailhead. I'd driven past it probably 100 times in the years I'd been working this area. Small farmhouse, older, white paint, had a small garden in the front yard, and usually had a truck in the driveway and a light on in the evenings. I'd never spoken to whoever lived there. Never had reason to. I drove down to it. The truck was gone from the driveway. The light inside wasn't on. The windows were intact. The front door was closed. I knocked, waited, knocked again, waited longer, called out. Nothing. I went in through the unlocked back door. I was fast. I wasn't proud, but I was fast. Kitchen first, canned goods, all of them, probably 30 cans of various things. Soup, beans, tomatoes, corn, tuna, sardines, peanut butter in a big jar, 2 pounds of dry lentils in a container, a bag of rice, most of a bag of oats, salt, pepper, a full jar of dried herbs, sugar, a box of baking soda, cooking oil, honey in a jar that was nearly full. I found seeds. This was the thing I wasn't expecting. In a drawer under the kitchen counter, There was a Ziploc bag full of small paper envelopes, and I shook one open on the counter, and they were seeds, labeled in careful handwriting. Beans, mustard greens, radishes, kale, chard. I took all of them. I found a propane lantern and 4 propane canisters in the back porch, a hand pump for the old well in the yard, a roll of heavy-duty plastic sheeting, rope, a shovel and a small hand trowel, an axe, a splitting maul, a hacksaw, a pair of leather work gloves. In the bedroom I found wool socks, 6 pairs, thick, and an extra sleeping bag that was old but intact, a wool sweater, a good pair of waterproof gloves, a headlamp. In the medicine cabinet, hydrogen peroxide, antiseptic cream, bandages, 2 ace bandages, some basic cold medicine, a half-full bottle of ibuprofen, a prescription bottle of antibiotics with about 12 pills left in it. I left the photographs on the walls. I left the furniture. I left the clothes that weren't useful. I left a $20 bill on the kitchen table, which I realize now is the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life. I made 3 trips. The truck's bed and cab were completely full by the time I finished, and the sun was getting low. I drove back up to the trailhead, loaded what I could carry in one run into my packs and into the plastic bins I was carrying by hand, and hiked back up to the cave. It took me until well after dark to get everything up. I made that run twice more over the next 2 days. Both times I went fast, went quiet, and came back up before noon. On the second run, on October 5th, I heard something on the road below the trailhead. Didn't go to look at it. Just heard it and stopped moving, and crouched in the brush for about 20 minutes, until I was sure it had moved on or stopped or wasn't coming up the trail. Then I went back up. I never went back to the truck after that. At some point in the next week, probably, someone came up the trailhead road and found it. It was registered to me. I think about that sometimes. I think about the idea that someone read my name off that registration, and either it meant nothing to them because they were desperate and just wanted the vehicle, or it meant something to them because they were looking for people who might be hiding nearby. The truck's been down there for 100 days now. I don't know what state it's in. Okay, so that was the first few days. Let me tell you about the cave itself, because you can't understand what the next 3 months were like without understanding the space. The entrance is not obvious. That's the first thing. There's a rock face along the upper trail that runs roughly east-west, limestone, marked by a series of horizontal stress fractures that look, from a distance, like a natural wall with a lot of shadow. The actual opening is about 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, partially obscured by a rock overhang and by a scrubby juniper that had grown up right in front of it. I'd found it originally 3 years ago because I'd been following a colony of Townsend's big-eared bats that had been using it as a maternity roost. I'd photographed them for 3 evenings from just inside the entrance, trying not to disturb the colony too badly, and in doing so, I'd explored the first chamber and gotten familiar with the basic layout. The first chamber is the main one. When you come through the entrance and stand upright, which you can do, the ceiling is about 8 feet, and you walk straight back. It opens out after about 15 feet into a space that's roughly oval, maybe 35 feet at its widest, and 20 feet deep. The ceiling goes up to maybe 12, 14 feet in the middle. The rock walls slope. The floor is uneven but manageable, and there's a natural crack along the back left corner that goes up through the rock and provides, I would discover this in the first week, a remarkably effective natural chimney. Not a fireplace-style chimney. A crack, maybe 4 inches wide at the bottom, widening to 8 or 10 higher up. That creates a draft when conditions are right. Enough to vent smoke from a small, careful fire without the smoke building up inside. Along the right wall there's a natural shelf. Rock jutting out at about waist height. Runs about 6 feet long. Flat enough to put things on. I use this for food storage, water containers, medical supplies. The floor of the main chamber has a slight depression in the center that I lined with flat stones from outside. This became my fire area. The chimney crack is maybe 15 feet from the fire area, and the draft pulls reliably from the fire toward the crack, which means if I keep the fire small and burn dry wood, the smoke mostly goes up and out, rather than filling the cave. I said mostly. I want to be accurate about this. There were nights where I got the fire wrong, and the smoke filled the lower part of the chamber, and I had to damp it down fast and sleep with my face as close to the ground as possible. There were other nights where the draft was so strong the fire roared and threw sparks, and I had to smother it with a flat stone I kept nearby specifically for that purpose. Learning how the cave breathed took about 2 weeks. After that, I had it mostly figured out. The crawl space to the second chamber is on the left wall, past the back of the main chamber. You go in feet first and low, and it's tight. Not terrible if you're not claustrophobic, but enough that the first time I went through with a full load I got briefly stuck and had to breathe through it. The second chamber is smaller, maybe 15 by 20, lower ceiling, almost always completely dark and cold, really cold. It stays around 40 degrees in there regardless of the season, which I learned later is because it connects through another crack, somewhere further back, to a deeper cave system I never fully explored. There's a slight airflow from that back crack, just a breath of it, but it keeps the second chamber like a refrigerator. I used the second chamber as cold storage, food, initially, and later other things. That's where Gerald Poole was. I should mention that I moved him to the very back corner of the second chamber, behind a natural rock partition that runs across the space and creates a sort of alcove. I covered him with one of the garbage bags from my truck. I didn't go back there unless I had to, but knowing he was there never stopped being something I was aware of. Some nights I'd wake up in the main chamber, dark, fire down to coals, the cave making its particular nighttime sounds of dripping water and rock settling, and I'd be aware of him back there behind the crawl space. Not afraid, exactly, not in a ghost story way, just aware. It changed the way I thought about the space, like sharing an apartment with someone who was never there but whose presence you couldn't stop noticing. A pair of shoes by the door, a dish in the sink. Except not like that at all, obviously, but that's the closest analogy I have. Anyway, days 4 through 10. Building phase, I guess, if you want to call it that. My photography background taught me to think systematically about constraints. What do you have? What do you need? What's the gap between them? How do you close it? I sat down on day 4. It was still early enough that I was sleeping more than I should have. I think my body was in some kind of mild shock, and I went through my situation carefully. Water. The cave had a seep along the back right wall, a slow trickle that came down the limestone and collected in a natural basin at the base of the wall, about the size of a large dinner plate. It wasn't much, but it was consistent. The problem was, I didn't know what was in it. Limestone caves can have high mineral content, can carry biological contaminants if there are bat colonies higher up, can be affected by whatever's on the surface above. I ran everything through my water filter as a matter of course, and I boiled it whenever I had fire going. In the first week, I also set up the plastic sheeting from the farmhouse, just inside the cave entrance, angled to catch and funnel rain. It didn't rain until day 7, but when it did, I collected about 3 gallons in a few hours. Rainwater filtered once was probably the safest thing I had. Long-term, water was going to be the hardest constraint. I was rationing to about 1.5 liters per day, which is below what you want in normal conditions, but I wasn't exerting much in those first days. As I started making foraging runs and doing more physical work, I pushed that up to 2 liters minimum. Food. I'd done better than I realized at the farmhouse. Total food supply, counting everything I'd taken from there, plus my original supplies, plus Gerald's pack. I estimated roughly 60 days of basic rations if I stretch things carefully. That sounds like a lot, and it is. But 60 days in October means running into December, and December in the mountains at this elevation means snow on the ground and limited foraging options and a lot of calorie burn just staying warm. I needed the 60 days to last 90, and I needed to be adding to my supply as I went, not just drawing it down. I started germinating seeds on day 5, split the envelopes I'd taken into 2 groups, the ones I was going to try growing in the cave, and the ones I was keeping as backup. The cave was not exactly ideal for plant growth, but I'd found, in my first few days, that the area just inside the entrance, maybe 10 feet in from the opening, before the passage narrows, got decent indirect light for most of the day. Not full sun, but enough. I filled 3 of the plastic bins with soil I'd scraped from the hillside above the entrance and mixed it with organic material I was honestly making up as I went. Dead leaves, decomposed wood, the dark forest duff from under the junipers outside. I planted beans and mustard greens and radishes, kept them close to the entrance for light, and far enough in to stay above freezing at night. They didn't all make it. The beans were too cold. The radishes did something I didn't expect, and actually grew reasonably well given the conditions. The mustard greens were slow but consistent. On day 6, I found the elk. I was doing a careful scout of the hillside above the cave, not going far, just getting a sense of the terrain I'd be operating in, and I came around a rock formation, maybe 200 feet above the entrance, and there it was. A bull elk, maybe 350 pounds, dead for what I estimated was about 2 or 3 days. No obvious predator activity on it yet, probably because the temperature had kept it fresh enough that the smell hadn't gone wide. It had blood around its nose and mouth, which can mean a lot of things in elk: pneumonia, collision, altitude-related hemorrhage. I couldn't tell what killed it, and I didn't spend a long time trying to figure it out. I went back to the cave, got my knife and the folding saw from the toolkit, and spent the better part of 3 days dealing with it. I won't pretend that was easy, or that I did it well. I've dressed game birds before, and once a deer, but I'm not a hunter. I'm a photographer. What I know about field dressing an elk I knew from books, and one YouTube rabbit hole I'd gone down a few years prior, after photographing a hunting party for a magazine assignment. I made a mess of it. I wasted more than I should have. But what I saved: ribs, 2 hindquarters, the tenderloin, the heart and liver, went into the second chamber, which was cold enough to function as a very rough refrigerator. I ate elk for the next 3 weeks. Cut it into thin strips and dried it over low fire when I had a fire going. Some of it dried, some of it went off before I could get to it. I threw out the parts that went bad without hesitation, because the last thing I needed at that point was food poisoning. The bones I kept. Boiled them repeatedly for broth, cracked them and scraped the marrow. A wildlife photographer knows that predators waste almost nothing from a kill, and in those first weeks, I was operating on that principle pretty closely. Day 8. I heard the first outbreak sounds from below. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I don't want to overstate what I actually knew. I was looking down at the valley through the 600mm lens, from a position I'd set up on a flat rock about 50 feet above the cave entrance. A natural observation point, with good sight lines to the valley floor and the town. I'd been doing this every morning and evening, not long sessions, just checking. Monitoring the way I'd monitor a watering hole before deciding whether to set up a blind. What I saw on the morning of day 8 was movement on the road below that I couldn't explain in normal terms. There were people on the highway, not driving, walking, and some of them were moving wrong. That's the only way I can put it. Moving wrong in a way that's immediately obvious through a 600mm lens, because that lens compresses everything and makes movement very readable. If you've spent years watching animal movement, the specific gait of a deer that's alert versus one that's relaxed, the way a hawk moves differently when it's hunting versus when it's just cruising, you develop a very precise sense of what normal biological movement looks like. What I was seeing was not that. I watched for about 40 minutes, long enough to see 2 incidents I won't describe in full, long enough to understand, at a level below rational thought, what was actually happening down there. Then I put the lens cap on and went back into the cave and started recalculating everything. The smoke I'd been seeing for the last 5 days was starting to make complete sense. On day 9, I built the door. Calling it a door is generous. What I did was spend most of the day gathering flat rocks from the hillside and stacking them against the cave entrance in a pattern that, from more than 10 feet away, just looked like the natural rock face. I didn't seal it. I needed to be able to get in and out. But I built up the lower portion so that the opening was reduced from 5 feet high to about 3 feet high, requiring anyone or anything entering to duck significantly. And I built it in a way that was freestanding and could be pulled inward from inside, so I could close it further. Then I took the juniper branches I'd trimmed away from the entrance to see better, and I wove them through the rock I'd stacked, and the effect was pretty good. Not invisible, but close enough that you'd walk past it if you weren't looking for it. And then I gathered more branches and swept the entire area in front of the entrance, the muddy patch of trail that was starting to show boot prints. I swept it out far enough that there was no obvious path leading to the cave. Day 10, I found the bat colony. I'd been so focused in the first week on the immediate practical concerns, food, water, sealing the entrance, processing the elk, that I hadn't spent much time thinking about the upper portions of the cave. The first chamber ceiling, the crack that served as a chimney, the back passages that I knew connected to deeper systems but hadn't explored. On the evening of day 10, I'd been watching the light fade through the slit of the entrance when I noticed something. The bats were still there. Not the maternity colony. This was October. They would have dispersed already. But a smaller group, maybe 30 or 40 individuals, had been roosting in the upper portion of the chimney crack, tucked into the wider part of the crevice, maybe 15 feet up. I'd been lighting small fires right below them for 9 days, and they hadn't left, which meant they were comfortable enough with me, or the smoke from the fires was thin enough not to bother them, or they were deep enough in the crevice that it didn't reach them. Probably all three. I was genuinely glad to see them. Bats in a cave serve functions you don't think about until you're living in one. The guano that accumulates below their roost is nitrogen-rich, in a way that's useful for the soil I was trying to grow things in. They eat insects, which meant the cave interior stayed remarkably clear of flies and beetles that would otherwise be drawn to my food stores. And they're one of the best movement alarms in nature. They're far more sensitive to air pressure changes and to sound than I am. And when they suddenly went quiet, or suddenly flushed out through the chimney crack, I paid attention. They flushed once on day 12. I was asleep. I came awake to the sound of them going. It's a papery, scratching, wing rush sort of sound, and I lay completely still for a long time with my headlamp off. Nothing happened. Nothing came near the entrance. But I didn't sleep again until it was fully light. Whatever they'd heard or sensed outside, whether it was an animal or something else, I never found out. From that point on, the bats were part of my alarm system. Let me talk about the sounds for a minute, because that's what the next several weeks were really defined by, more than anything visual. The cave has its own acoustic character that's completely different from being in a building or even in a tent. Sound moves differently in stone. Sounds from outside are filtered in a specific way. Some things amplify and some things get swallowed. Rain on the hillside outside sounds like breathing, low and steady. Wind through the juniper at the entrance makes a note that changes with direction and speed in ways I eventually learned to read. The drip from the seep has a rhythm that only breaks if something in the water table above changes, which it did once after a heavy rain. The sounds from the valley below, especially once things got worse down there, traveled up the mountain in unpredictable ways. Sound does strange things in mountain terrain. It bounces off rock faces, follows drainages, gets channeled up gullies in ways that make distances irrelevant. I heard a car alarm from Kettrick on day 11, clear as if it were 100 yards away, and it ran for about 4 minutes, and then went silent. On day 13, I heard gunshots, 3, then a pause, then 2 more, then nothing. On day 15, I heard something that I still don't fully know how to categorize, a sort of collective sound, coming from the direction of the main highway, a kind of noise that wasn't traffic and wasn't a crowd in any normal sense. I listened to it for about 10 minutes. It had a particular quality I'd only heard once before, from a large colony of sea lions on a rock offshore during a shoot, but this wasn't that either. I went to the back of the cave and stayed there until it faded. By day 15, I had the space organized into distinct zones. Sleeping area, the left side of the main chamber, lined with the rubber mat I'd peeled off the truck bed, sleeping bag on top, Gerald Poole's bag laid over it as an extra layer. Cooking area, the flat stone ring around the fire depression, the camp stove nearby for when I didn't want to make a full fire, a flat rock serving as a prep surface. Storage, the shelf on the right wall for non-perishables, the bins stacked below it, the second chamber through the crawl space for anything cold sensitive. Work area, near the entrance, where the light was best, where I'd set up the flat stone I used as a table. Growing area. The 3 bins along the right side of the entrance passage, turned toward the daylight. I had a rough routine by day 15. Wake before full light. Check the entrance. Listen. Look. Smell before I showed any part of myself. Collect and filter water from the seep, and check the rain catcher if it had rained. Eat something small. Morning observation session on the rock above the cave with the 600mm, scanning the valley and the road. Come back in. Work on whatever the day's problem was. Fortifying, foraging, processing food, building something. Afternoon. The long, quiet stretch where I let myself do nothing productive. Just sat and thought or read the hiking map I had until I had it memorized. Evening observation. Shorter. Small meal. Fire if temperature required it. Sleep. The routine matters more than people think. I know that sounds like advice, and I'm not trying to give you advice. I'm just telling you what I learned. The routine was the thing that kept my head on straight, or reasonably straight. When the routine was consistent, I was okay. The days where something broke the routine were the days where the psychological weight became most noticeable. Day 16. First real forage run. I'm going to tell you that I'd been outside the immediate cave area, obviously, the observation point, the elk site, the entrance perimeter, but I hadn't gone more than maybe 300 feet from the cave entrance in the first 2 weeks. On day 16, I pushed further. Went about a half-mile north along the ridgeline. Stayed high, stayed under tree cover. Spent about 4 hours moving carefully and gathering. Pine nuts from the mature pinyon pines along the ridge. This was late season for them, and a lot had already dropped, but I found enough. Wild rose hips from a shrub on the south-facing slope, full of vitamin C and already starting to dry on the branch from the frost. Dried yarrow, which I knew as a mild medicinal plant. Some dead wood for fire. Dry, dense, the kind that burns hot and low smoke. I didn't see anything unusual, but I heard, on my way back, a sound from somewhere down the north slope below the ridge that made me go very still. It was a voice, a human voice, not words I could make out. The distance was too great, but the cadence and pitch of it was wrong. It wasn't someone calling for help in the way a person calls for help, with a clear distress pattern. It was more like someone talking to themselves, or maybe singing very softly, but with no rhythm to it, inconsistent in volume. It went on for about 3 minutes and then stopped. I waited another 20 minutes before I moved. I don't know what that was. I told myself it was an infected. What I know about infected from observation, and by day 16 I'd observed enough to have some working understanding, is that they make sounds. They're not silent. They vocalize in response to stimuli. They make noise when they're moving fast or when they've sensed something. They don't typically sing softly to themselves on a hillside, but they also don't do things you'd expect them to. They're unpredictable in ways that are worse than predictable, because predictable you can plan for. I got back to the cave without incident, and I didn't go out the next day. I needed 1 day that was entirely inside. Just needed it. Day 18. I came closest to despair, or what I'd call despair in those first weeks. Later, the bar for despair shifted considerably, but at day 18, it was the quiet that got to me. Not the cave's internal quiet, which I'd come to understand and had almost made my peace with. The external quiet. I'd gone to the observation point in the morning and scanned the valley, and there was almost nothing happening down there. No movement I could see. The smoke columns that had been a constant feature since day 1 had died down to one, faint, somewhere on the east side of Kettrick. The highway had no movement. The town's visible streets, the main drag and a few cross streets, maybe a quarter-mile visible from my position, had cars in them, but no people. It wasn't reassuring. You might think it would be, right? Quiet means it's settling down. Things are improving. That's not what I thought. I thought, where did everyone go? Either the infected had moved on or moved elsewhere, in which case the question was why and where, or they'd spread through the town completely, and there was nobody left uninfected to make any noise or cause any movement. I didn't know which. I spent a long time thinking about it, and came to no conclusion, and went back inside. I wrote in a notebook that evening for the first time since I'd arrived. Not a journal exactly, more like field notes. I'd been a wildlife photographer for 12 years, and field notes were how I thought. Observation, condition, behavior, hypothesis. I wrote, town quiet, day 5 of no visible movement on highway. One smoke column remaining, east side. 2 possible explanations, neither good. Camera check needed. The camera check had become a thing I did every few days. I was burning through batteries and I was anxious about it. The battery packs I had for the camera bodies and the chargers were all dependent eventually on power, and I had no power. What I had was the portable solar panel I'd found on the 3rd truck clearing run, a small folding panel, about the size of a magazine, that I'd bought for a backcountry shoot 2 years prior, and never really used much. It produced about 10 watts in direct sun, which was enough to slowly charge my phone and 1 camera battery at a time if I left the panel in the sun for a full afternoon. The problem was that taking things outside and leaving them there, even things as small and low profile as a folding solar panel, felt like a risk I wasn't always willing to take. I started keeping very strict track of battery levels, primary camera body, shoot as needed for observations, minimum, secondary body, backup, kept charged, barely used, phone, kept at around 30%, checked for signal every few days, no signal. The hand crank radio from the gas station. This became important. I don't know exactly when I opened it, day 10 or 11. I wound the crank for a while and started scanning frequencies. I found static mostly, a lot of static. There was a signal on 1620 AM that sounded like an emergency broadcast, but the reception was too broken up to follow consistently. On the FM side, I found nothing until I hit 91.7, where I got, very faintly, something that might have been a voice or might have been interference. I kept the radio off to preserve the crank mechanism and tuned in briefly each evening. On day 19, I caught it clearly for about 40 seconds. A voice, male, calm, but with an exhaustion underneath it, giving what sounded like coordinates and a status report. I caught the words Eastern Ridge and confirmed clear and come back on in 2 hours. Then it faded again. Someone was coordinating something. I didn't know what or where, or whether it was official or civilian, or whether the area they were calling clear was actually clear. I wrote it down and listened for it the next evening. Got nothing. The evening after that, I caught a different voice on the same frequency, higher pitched, shorter transmissions, what sounded like a location name I didn't recognize. I didn't respond. I want to be very clear about that, because it matters later in the story. I had the capability to transmit on that CB radio, my truck's CB, which I'd brought up on the 2nd run, and I had the frequency. I chose not to. Every time I thought about keying the mic, I thought about what broadcasting my presence into an open frequency would mean, who might hear it, where they might come from, what they might want. I'd spent enough days looking down at that valley through my 600mm to have developed a very specific distrust of other people. Right. Day 22. I need to tell you about the water system. This was the most important thing I built, and I'm telling you about it because it's the thing that made it possible to stay for as long as I did. Without the water system, I would have been in serious trouble by the 2nd month. The seep was inconsistent. It slowed down in dry weather, and I couldn't rely on it. The rain collection was good, but rain wasn't constant. I needed a reliable source. Above the cave, maybe 80 feet up the slope, there was a rocky gully that channeled runoff from the slope above. Even in dry weather, there was moisture in that gully, moss on the walls of it, wet rock, a few small pooled areas. On day 22, I spent a full day running a system of flexible tubing I'd salvaged from the farmhouse, the garden hose, cut into sections, and sections of the heavy-duty plastic sheeting, to create a collection and channeling system from the base of that gully down to the cave entrance. I connected it to a container inside the entrance, the 5-gallon jug from my truck. It was crude, and it leaked at connections, and it took me most of day 23 to sort out the leaks with duct tape and ingenuity. But when it worked, which was most of the time, it gave me a slow but steady supplement to the seep water. The water I was collecting was surface water running over rock, and it picked up all sorts of things. I filtered it twice before I stored it. When I used it for cooking, I boiled it. I never got sick from the water in 100 days, which I count as one of my better accomplishments. The other thing I built in that third week was the signal barrier. I know that's not what it's called, but that's what I called it. The observation position above the cave was exposed. When I was up there with the 600mm on the tripod, I was relatively visible from below, if anyone below was looking with similar equipment. I spent a day gathering dead brush and building a natural-looking blind around the observation rock, the kind of thing I'd done dozens of times for wildlife photography. Pile of dead branches, some draped tarp canvas, looks from a distance like a debris pile or a fallen tree. I could set up inside it and get sightlines through gaps in the brush to the valley below. Nobody was looking from the valley at that point, but I built it anyway, because the alternative was to wait until someone was looking, and then it would be too late. The blind ended up having a use I didn't anticipate, which I'll get to. Day 25. Let me talk about what the valley looked like by then, because things were evolving. The smoke in Kettrick was gone by about day 20. What replaced it was a particular kind of stillness that's hard to describe if you haven't spent time observing environments closely. A town shouldn't look like that. Not destroyed, not burned. Just empty in a way that has a texture to it, like a painting of a town rather than an actual one. Through the 600mm, I could see cars on the main street, some of them in positions that didn't make sense. Stopped at angles, doors open, one up on the curb. Windows in several buildings were broken. One of the diners had what looked like fabric hanging out of a second-floor window, a curtain or a bed sheet. I saw infected in the town on day 25 for the first time clearly. 3 of them, in the parking lot of the Walgreens. They were doing nothing. That's the thing I want to convey. They weren't running. They weren't attacking. They weren't doing anything you'd describe as purposeful. They were just present, moving occasionally, stopping, starting again, like something that needed external input to have a direction. 2 of them were clustered near the corner of the building, and one was walking slowly along the edge of the lot, not in any particular direction, bumping into the shopping cart corral and then redirecting. I watched them for about 20 minutes. They looked wrong. Not scary monster wrong. Wrong in the specific way that a person who's having a severe neurological episode looks wrong. Something underneath the normal human movement pattern has broken down, and what's left is a version of the body doing its best with whatever instructions it's still receiving. The gait was off. The head movements were off. The way they responded to each other's proximity, not acknowledging it but also not being unaffected by it, was the most unsettling part. I put the cap on the lens and went back into the cave and sat with that for a while. By this point, I had a rough understanding of the rules. I was operating on observed behavior, plus what I'd gathered from the radio fragments, and one bit of news I'd caught on day 17, when the emergency signal on 16:20 a.m. was clear enough to understand for about 2 minutes. What I understood, transmission was through bite and fluid transfer. Incubation was fast, hours, not days. Those infected retained physical function but lost the higher cognitive stuff, the planning and the abstract reasoning, in a way that reduced their behavior to something very input-response, stimulus-driven. Sound brought them, movement brought them. They didn't navigate based on memory or plan routes. They went where something pulled them and stopped when there was nothing pulling. They couldn't climb in any meaningful way. They couldn't open doors. They didn't problem solve. What they were was a population of mobile, persistent threats that were individually manageable if you kept your head and became genuinely dangerous in numbers or when you made noise in the wrong place. The mountain was, for now, mostly safe, because the mountain required effort to climb, and the infected didn't seek effort. They went where the inputs were, and the inputs were in the valley, not the mountain. Not yet. On day 29, something changed in the valley that I want to make sure I explain correctly, because it's the thing that really locked me in to the long-term plan. I was doing my morning observation when I saw vehicles on the highway. 3 of them, moving together, coming in from the direction of the bigger town 20 miles east. A pickup, a panel van, and some kind of SUV with what might have been a push bar on the front. They moved through Kettrick's main street. I tracked them for about 8 minutes through the lens, and didn't stop. Kept going west on the highway, drove right through the infected in the parking lot, which caused the infected to follow for a while before losing the vehicle. Then 2 things happened that I need to tell you about in the right order, because the order matters. First, about an hour after the convoy passed through, I saw a group of people on foot emerge from a building on the south side of Main Street. 6 people, maybe 7, moving with purpose toward the highway. They were carrying things. Bags, what looked like containers. They were alive. They were moving like normal people, and they had clearly been in that building for some time. When the convoy had passed, they came out. Second, 15 minutes after those people emerged, the infected in the parking lot, which had dispersed when the vehicles went through, came back. Not just the original 3, more of them. 10, maybe 12, coming in from different directions, converging on the south side of Main Street. The group of people saw them. I watched what happened. It was fast, and it was bad, and I'm not going to describe it in full. One person got into a car and drove. I lost track of them. The others, I don't know. I looked away. What I understood, from watching that sequence, was that other people were now one of my primary risks. Because other people made noise, and noise attracted infected, and the infected went where the noise was. Proximity to other survivors was, in certain configurations, more dangerous than proximity to the infected themselves. I spent the rest of that day inside the cave, didn't go to the observation point, just sat in the main chamber by a very small fire and thought about what I'd seen. Day 30. My bean sprouts had done nothing. The radishes were actually growing, small green spikes coming up through the soil, then actual leaf growth. The mustard greens were thin and leggy from the indirect light, but alive. I supplemented the soil with bat guano, carefully collected from below the roost, mixed it into the top of each bin. I was learning as I went. I'd read about cave farming exactly once in a magazine, about a year prior, an article about mushroom cultivation in an abandoned rail tunnel, and I remembered almost nothing specific from it, but the general principle. Give living things what they need with what you have. I started mushrooms on day 32. I'd found what I was fairly sure were oyster mushrooms growing on a dead log up the north ridge on my second foraging run. I'd taken a section of the log, maybe 8 inches long, back to the cave and kept it in the second chamber, cold and damp, wrapped in one of the garbage bags. On day 32, I unwrapped it and set it near the entrance in a spot with some moisture and air circulation and the secondary light from outside. Within 2 weeks, I had a small but actual flush of mushrooms. Not enough to eat as a main food source. Enough to add to whatever else I was having and provide some nutrition I wasn't getting from dried elk and canned beans. Day 34. The radio gave me something useful. I'd been tuning in every evening and getting mostly static or fragments. On day 34, I caught a sustained transmission for about 8 minutes on 91.7, the clearest signal I'd had, a man's voice, and I got the distinct impression from the cadence and the formality of what he was saying that he'd recorded this and was playing it on a loop. The message: there was a settlement being established at a location he called the Haddon facility, which meant nothing to me. He gave a direction, south of Greenview, which was a town about 30 miles south of Kettrick. He gave what I understood to be basic conditions: clean water, structure, medical supplies limited. He said, come in daylight only on the Route 40 approach. He said the frequency would be monitored at dawn and dusk. I listened to it 3 times, wrote it down, thought about it for 2 days, and then I put the notebook back on the shelf and went to check on my radishes. Here's the thing about other survivor settlements, and I'm aware this sounds paranoid, but I want to explain the reasoning as it was actually happening in my head, not as it sounds in retrospect. The settlement at Haddon was real, probably. The man on the radio sounded competent and genuine. And if I were thinking purely about long-term survival probability, a group of people with structure and medical supplies was objectively better than a man alone in a cave. That's math. But the convoy that had come through Kettrick on day 29 was also a group of people with vehicles and purpose. And right before they showed up, a group of survivors had been sheltering successfully in a building on the south side of Main Street. Hidden, quiet, alive. And then the convoy came through making noise, and those survivors came out, and what happened to them happened. I wasn't ready to stop being quiet. Not yet. Not yet became my mantra for a while. When I'd think about the radio, about Haddon, about the people making their way somewhere together, I'd just say not yet. Not yet meant I hadn't decided anything. Not yet was different from never. It gave me the feeling of a choice I was still making, rather than one I'd already made by default. Around day 38 or 39, the sounds from above started. I want to tell you about this carefully, because it's one of the things that stays with me most from those months. The cave system I was living in was not, as I've said, a simple single chamber. It went back further than the second chamber where Gerald Poole was, though I hadn't explored past that point. On day 38, I was in the main chamber in the late afternoon, fire going low, the light at the entrance shifting from gold to blue as the evening came in, and I heard something from the crawl space that led to the second chamber. A sound, not from Gerald's side of the crawl space, from further back, from whatever connected to the second chamber deeper in. It was rhythmic, not a pattern exactly, but with a quality to it, like something striking a surface repeatedly, but not with purpose, not with any goal, just striking it. Knock, then a pause. Knock, knock, then a longer pause. Knock. I sat very still for about 20 minutes. It stopped. I didn't sleep well that night. On day 40, I went into the second chamber with both headlamps, one on my head, one held in my hand, and I explored the back of it for the first time properly. The crack I'd been vaguely aware of, in the very back of the second chamber past where Gerald was bigger than I'd thought. Not a crack, an opening, maybe 18 inches wide and 2 feet high, rough and jagged, opening into a dark passage going deeper and angling slightly upward. The airflow I'd noticed was coming from it, and there was something on the rock floor around the opening that I noticed when I crouched down to look. Mud. Not cave mud. The cave floor didn't have mud in it. It was bare rock. This was surface mud, mixed with organic material, the kind of mud you'd find on a trail after rain. There were marks in it that might have been footprints. They were too degraded to be certain, and they could have been from animals. The passage, wherever it went, clearly connected eventually to the surface and had been used by wildlife as a transit point. Or they might not have been from animals. I went back through the crawl space into the main chamber, sat down, thought. The cave had another entrance. That's what I was understanding. Somewhere further up the mountain, probably a significant distance, given the angle of the passage and the direction it was going. There was another way in, maybe multiple, which meant that my sealed entrance was not the only access point. I spent the next 3 days addressing this. First, I explored the passage as far as I could safely go alone with 2 headlamps. I went in about 60 feet before it became too narrow for me to continue without proper equipment. In those 60 feet, I found 2 things of significance. 1, a dead bat, very recent, with markings I didn't recognize from the species I'd been observing in the roost. This suggested the passage connected to a different part of the cave system used by a different population. 2, on the wall of the passage at about the 40-foot mark, someone had scratched letters into the limestone. Not recently. The marks were old, weathered into the rock in a way that suggested years at minimum. Bureau 1997-40 IN. A name and a date and a depth marker. Someone had explored this passage 26 years ago, maybe made it further than I did. Second, back in the second chamber, I built a barrier across the entrance to the passage. I didn't seal it. The airflow was important for maintaining the temperature differential I was relying on, but I stacked rocks across it in a way that would make it very difficult for anything larger than a cat to get through without making substantial noise. And I laid several empty cans on top of the rock pile in a way that they'd fall and clatter if the pile was disturbed. The can alarm was the best security I built in the whole 100 days. Third, I made the second chamber, where Gerald was, into a secondary shelter. I moved a duplicate set of essential supplies through the crawl space. 1 set of each: water filter, A day's worth of food, my fixed-blade knife, an extra headlamp with spare batteries, the emergency blanket, the small butane stove, and 2 fuel canisters. I thought of this as my contingency. If something happened in the main chamber that I couldn't manage, if I had to retreat fast, I could go through the crawl space, pull the loose rock barrier I'd built at the crawl space entrance closed behind me, and be in a secondary position with enough to last a day or two. I'm glad I built it. The reason I'm glad I built it happens later. But right now, let me skip ahead a little, because the next stretch, days 40 to 50, was the most psychologically difficult period of the whole 100 days, and I want to try to explain that in a way that's honest, without being dramatic about it. Here's what isolation does. Not immediately. Immediately you're busy. You're working on problems. You're in survival mode. And that mode is actually somewhat protective, because it focuses your attention outward. It's around the 6-week mark, or it was for me, when the processing slows down enough that you start hearing your own thoughts in a way you don't when you're occupied with something external. And your thoughts are, they're not great company. They're not neutral. They find things to chew on. For me, it was decisions I'd made, not survival decisions. Those I felt mostly okay about. Personal ones. Relationships I'd let go because the work always came first. A brother in Portland I hadn't talked to in 2 years, over something I couldn't even fully articulate anymore. A woman named Diane who I'd been seeing for about 8 months and who I'd ended things with because, and this is the part that sat badly in the long empty afternoons of week 6, because I'd gotten a wildlife contract in Botswana, and the timeline didn't work, and I'd chosen Botswana. She'd been in Portland. I didn't know if Portland was still there. Based on what I'd read on my phone in those first minutes of signal before I came up the mountain, Portland was one of the early focal points. I thought about Diane a lot between days 40 and 50. I thought about my brother. I thought about my parents, in their 70s now, retired to a small town in eastern Oregon, whether those places were the kind of places that had any protection, whether small towns were better or worse than cities. I came to no conclusions about any of it. I just thought about it, repeatedly, in loops, the way you do when you have nowhere to put the thinking. On day 47, I made myself a rule. 1 hour per day. I was allowed to think about before. 1 hour, and I'd keep it to the window between noon and 1 in the afternoon. And when the hour was up, I'd go do something physical. Split wood, move rocks, dig the waste pit I'd been putting off digging. Something that required my body to be occupied enough that my head couldn't follow the same paths. It helped. Not completely, but it helped. The waste pit, since I mentioned it, I dug it on day 48, at the furthest point I'd established in my perimeter, which was about 120 feet from the cave entrance on the south side, downhill and downwind. This is the stuff nobody ever tells you about survival situations in fiction, but it's the stuff that matters. Where do you go to the bathroom? What do you do with the waste? How do you manage it in a way that doesn't become a sanitation problem or a smell problem that leads something back to you? I dug it properly, 3 feet deep, marked with rocks so I didn't accidentally go near it at night. And I covered each use with a layer of soil from the pile I kept nearby. I'd been improvising before this, and the improvisation was not something I'm proud of. The pit was better. Day 51. The dog arrived. I'm going to take some time telling you about this because the dog became one of the most important things in the second half of those 100 days, and you deserve to understand it properly. I heard it before I saw it. Day 50, actually. Heard it the night before I found it. A sound from outside the cave entrance, around 2 in the morning by my rough estimation, that woke me from a dead sleep. Low, not a bark, more of a sustained, low vocalization that dogs make when they're confused or distressed. It went on for maybe 30 seconds and then stopped. I lay still for a long time afterward. It didn't repeat. Morning of day 51 I found her. She was outside the cave entrance, 10 feet from it, sitting on the flat rock I used as a mat for taking off my boots before going inside. A medium-sized dog, I'd say around 35 or 40 pounds, some kind of herding mix. The shape of her face was collie, but her coat was shorter, mottled brown and black and white, and she had one eye that was a pale amber and one that was dark. She was very thin, The kind of thin where you can read the bone structure of the skull clearly. Her paws were damaged, raw, cracked. One of the front pads looked like it had bled recently. She had no collar. When I came out of the cave, she didn't run. She looked at me, and then looked away, and then looked at me again. I went back inside and got one of the strips of dried elk I had on the shelf. Came back out. She watched me put it on the ground between us, and then watched me step back, and she waited for about 20 seconds, and then she took it. I let her sleep outside the entrance that first night, brought her more food. On day 53, she came inside. I want to be clear that I understood the risks. A dog is noise, and a dog is a food demand, and a dog is something that can attract other things or alert others to your presence. I was clear-eyed about all of this when I let her in, and I let her in anyway. I'm not going to rationalize it as a tactical decision, because it wasn't purely that. It was loneliness. 6 weeks of mostly silence, broken only by the cave and the wind, and the distant sounds from below, and a living creature of any kind choosing to be near me. I wasn't going to refuse that. I called her Rue, for no particular reason, except it felt right, and I'd always liked the word. She slept at the foot of my sleeping bag from the first night she was inside. She was quiet. This turned out to be one of her most valuable qualities. She didn't bark for no reason. She would growl, very low, almost subsonic, when she sensed something outside that she didn't like. She'd go to the entrance and stand there with her head very still and her ears forward, reading whatever her nose was telling her, and I learned quickly to pay close attention to when she did this and what direction she was facing. She flushed the bats twice in the first 2 weeks she was with me. Not deliberately, just by moving into the rear portion of the main chamber for some reason and disturbing the airflow enough. The first time I almost hit the ceiling, I was so startled. After that, I knew to expect it, and I could gauge from how they flushed, fast and total, or slowly and partial, how serious the disturbance was. Rue ate whatever I ate. I didn't have dog food. She ate dried elk, canned beans mixed with rice, a small share of whatever mushrooms I had, the occasional pine nuts. She never refused anything. That level of adaptation seemed to confirm that she'd been alone for some time, before she found me. I thought about where she'd come from. She had the kind of calm that comes from being a working dog. She'd been trained to some degree. You could tell from how she responded to hand signals I made up. Picked them up fast, remembered them. Someone had owned her. Someone who probably wasn't somewhere I could find them anymore. I didn't think about that too much. The hour between noon and 1 was already crowded. Day 55. The infected came into the cave system. I want to be precise about what happened, because the version in my head has gotten overlaid with emotion in ways that might distort the sequence. What I know factually is this. I was in the main chamber in the late afternoon. It was getting dark outside early, because we were into November now. I had a very small fire going. Rue was at the front of the chamber between me and the crawlspace entrance. She went rigid. Not toward the main entrance, toward the crawlspace, toward the second chamber. Her growl was so low I almost didn't hear it, but I'd been living with her long enough to notice. She was looking at the crawlspace opening, and her growl had a specific texture I hadn't heard from her before. I put out the fire immediately, smothered it with the flat stone. The chamber went from dim amber to black instantly, and I waited for my eyes to adjust, which they don't, in total cave darkness, which is what I had now. Total, no ambient light. I had my headlamp, but I didn't put it on. I reached for Rue in the dark and found her, and put my hand on her side, and felt her still growling, still facing the crawl space. Then I heard the cans. The can alarm in the second chamber. The cans I'd stacked on the rock pile across the back passage entrance. They didn't fall. They shifted. A muted clatter that lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then silence. Something had disturbed the pile. From the passage side. I want to tell you that I was very calm. I wasn't. My hands were shaking and my heart was doing something it has no business doing, and I was aware of my breath in a way that felt dangerously loud. I got Rue with one hand, moved us both back against the left wall of the main chamber, as far from the crawl space as I could get while staying inside. I got my knife out. Not the hatchet. I'd put the hatchet down by the fire area, and I wasn't going to feel my way across the chamber in the dark to find it. 5 minutes. Nothing. 8 minutes. Rue gradually stopped growling. Not all at once. It faded slowly, like a dial being turned down. 12 minutes. I turned on the headlamp, low, pointed at the crawl space. Nothing in the crawl space. Nothing in the main chamber. I waited another 15 minutes. Then I went through the crawl space into the second chamber with the headlamp and the knife. The can alarm was disturbed. Several cans had shifted. Some had fallen inward. The rock pile was largely intact, but there was a gap along the bottom right, where one of the smaller rocks had been pushed inward. Not a big gap. Not enough for a person. Enough for something the size of a large animal. On the floor of the second chamber, in front of the rock pile, there were two things. A dark smear on the rock that I identified after a long moment as blood. Not old blood, recent enough to still be wet, and a clump of dark hair, or what I first thought was hair, caught on the jagged edge of one of the rocks in the pile. I looked at it for a long time. It wasn't hair. The texture was wrong. It was more like matted fiber, like clothing. Like something had pushed against the rock pile from the other side hard enough to leave a piece of itself behind. The passage smelled wrong. Not animal wrong, human wrong, in the specific way that things had been wrong in the valley. A sweetish smell undercut by something else. I went back to the main chamber. Didn't sleep. Rebuilt the rock pile in the crawl space. The barrier at the crawl space entrance from the main chamber. Bigger and more solid. Added weight to it. Stacked the heaviest bins against it from the main chamber side. On day 56, I made a decision. The second chamber was no longer safe as a retreat position, which meant I needed a new plan. I spent days 56 and 57, working during daylight only, with Rue keeping watch near the crawl space, converting the main chamber's entrance area into a secondary defense position. I built a second stone barrier inside the entrance itself, a few feet in from the opening, designed to narrow the passage to a single body width, and to make it impossible to enter without making noise and without being seen from inside. I installed the remaining tin cans on a string across the narrowest point. I relocated all my critical supplies from the back of the main chamber to the front half, near the entrance, so that if I needed to leave fast I wasn't crossing the full chamber, and I started sleeping with the knife unsheathed. Rue slept with her back against the entrance barrier from that night on. I didn't teach her to do that. She just started doing it. On day 60, I went back to the second chamber. Carefully, very carefully, with Rue staying at the crawl space entrance to alert me if anything changed. I went in, and I went to the rock pile, and I looked at it, and I listened. Nothing from the passage, no smell. The wet smear on the floor had dried to a brown stain. I added 3 more layers to the rock pile. I filled every gap I could see with smaller rocks and sediment from the cave floor. I brought in the dirt-filled bins I no longer needed for growing and stacked them in front of the pile. By the time I was done, the passage entrance was completely blocked from the second chamber side, sealed as completely as I could manage with what I had. The airflow dropped noticeably that night, and the second chamber's temperature rose a few degrees without the cold air coming through. I lost my refrigeration, more or less. I moved what cold-sensitive stores remained into the main chamber near the entrance, where the cold draft from outside provided some effect. I never went back to check on Gerald Poole. I'd like to say I did, as a kind of final decency. I didn't. The back alcove of the second chamber was behind all those bins now, and I couldn't reach it without dismantling everything, and I wasn't going to do that. I told myself he understood. I don't know what I meant by that. Day 62. Something happened in the valley that I want to tell you about because it changed my understanding of the timeline. I was at the observation blind at around 10 in the morning. Clear day. The first clear day in almost a week after a stretch of rain that had been good for water collection, but hard on everything else. I was scanning the highway east of Kettrick, and I saw something that took me a while to process. The infected in Kettrick. I'd been seeing them at similar numbers, and in roughly similar locations, since around day 25, maybe 40 to 60 individuals in the visible area at any given time, had reduced significantly, not to zero. But where I'd been seeing clusters of 10 or 15 in the parking lot areas and along the main commercial stretch, now I was seeing individuals, alone or in pairs, and they were moving differently. Less of the aimless stimulus response I'd documented, more directed in a loose way, as if there was something drawing them somewhere I couldn't see from my position. I watched a lone infected on the east end of Main Street for about 15 minutes. It started at the corner of what I think was the pharmacy building, and it slowly, inconsistently, but with a general trend, moved east. East and slightly south, in the direction of a residential area I couldn't see well from my position. I had a theory. I didn't like the theory. The theory was that they were following something, either a sound source or an actual presence of uninfected humans, somewhere out of my sightline, and that something was either the settlement at Haddon, if Haddon was in that direction, or another group that had made noise they shouldn't have. I couldn't confirm it. I filed it and watched the town's visible area more carefully over the next few days, and the pattern held. The visible infected population was gradually declining. Not because they were dying, I had no evidence of that, but because they were moving elsewhere. This created a very specific problem, which was that I didn't know where elsewhere was, and elsewhere might include uphill. Rue started alerting to the entrance more frequently around day 65. Not with the deep growl of the earlier incident. That growl was for something definite. This was different. A slight stiffening, ears forward. Then she'd relax, like she was catching a scent, and then losing it. It happened twice a day for most of day 65, once on 66, 3 times on 67. On day 68, she woke me at roughly 3 in the morning, alert, facing the entrance, standing at the string of cans. She didn't make a sound. She looked at me once, and then went back to facing the entrance. I lay still for 2 hours. Whatever it was didn't come. Eventually, Rue lay down. Eventually, I went back to a light approximation of sleep. I started thinking more carefully about noise management. I'd been careful about fire smoke, and about obvious movement near the entrance, but I'd been less careful about ambient sound. Talking to myself, which I'd been doing more than I'd care to admit through the 6th and 7th week. The radio. Coughing. I have a cough that acts up in cold and damp. Had it for years. It's nothing serious, but it's real, and it's periodic, and in a quiet mountain night it would travel. I started managing the cough actively, suppressing it when I could, covering it when I couldn't, drinking more water to keep my throat clear. I stopped using the radio at night entirely, and moved the transmission window to noon, when ambient sounds, wind in the trees, birds, covered it better. And then, day 70. Day 70 is the day I'm going to take my time describing, because it's the day that changed everything about how I thought about other people in this situation. I want to tell it as it happened, in sequence, because the sequence matters. I woke up to Rue alerting at the entrance, 7 in the morning by my rough reckoning. I'd long since given up on my watch and gone by light. Dawn was coming in through the entrance slit, and Rue was at the cans, facing out, ears forward, tail low, the alert posture. I moved to the entrance, pressed myself against the right wall inside, where I could look through one of the gaps in the stone barrier without showing myself. The outside was clear, the ledge in front of the entrance, the overhang, the juniper, all as it should be. Nothing visible. But Rue was still stiff. I listened. Wind. A bird somewhere up the ridge. A Steller's jay probably, based on the call. The drip of the water system into the container. My own breathing. And then, distant and coming from the trail below, voices. Not one voice, multiple. Talking. Not whispering. Not yelling either, but the normal conversational volume of people who feel relatively safe, or who have stopped worrying about noise management. I couldn't make out words at first, just the pattern of conversation. One voice, then another responding, then a third briefer one, 3 people at minimum. I put my hand on Rue's back, and she felt the pressure, and went flat on the cave floor, which I hadn't trained her to do, but which she understood from something innate, or from whatever her previous life had taught her. I didn't move from the entrance wall for the next 4 hours. They came up the trail. I tracked them by sound. They were moving carefully, but not in the practiced silence way of people who'd been surviving in exposed terrain for months. They stopped periodically. I heard the sounds of equipment, bags, maybe something being put down and picked up. At one point I heard someone say, clearly, "Doesn't make sense. There's nothing up here." And a voice I'd identified as the main speaker responded with something I couldn't fully catch, except the phrase, "boot print" in it. Boot print. I looked down at the entrance ledge outside. I'd been meticulous about sweeping, but the rain 4 days ago had softened some of the mud above the path to the observation blind, and I had been up there since the rain. I'd made prints in the soft soil, and I hadn't gone back to clear them since, because I hadn't been outside in the last 2 days. I understand that I'd made a mistake. It was sitting in my chest in a specific way, a cold way. They came up to the ledge. I know this because I heard them on it. The particular scrape of boots on the flat rock I recognized by the sound of it, and the change in the echo pattern of their voices as they came into the overhang space. 3 of them, I thought, maybe 4. Through the gap in my stone barrier I could see approximately a square foot of the outside. A pair of boots passed in that square foot. Military-style boots, worn, tan with dirt on them, moving slowly, stopping. A voice, very close now. The brush pile. Somebody built that. Another voice, lower. Could be old. First voice. No. Look at the cut ends. That's recent. They were looking at the blind above the cave, which was 20 feet away and upslope and visible from the ledge. My mouth was dry. Rue was still flat on the floor, watching me, waiting for a cue. I'm going to tell you something that I'm not proud of, and I'm going to tell it plainly. I had, inside the cave with me, 2 objects that could have been used as weapons. The fixed blade knife, the hatchet. I was holding the knife. I thought about the hatchet. I thought about what it would mean to use either of them. I thought about it very specifically, not in a vague theoretical way, but in a concrete, step-by-step way. The entrance was narrow, 1 person at a time. The stone barrier, the element of darkness, versus their eyes adjusting. I thought about it, and then I put the knife back in the sheath. Not because I'd decided they weren't a threat. I didn't know if they were. Not because I felt confident. I didn't. I put it back because I'd heard their voices for the last 40 minutes, and they sounded like people, and I wasn't ready to stop thinking of people as people. I made myself very small against the wall. I put my hand on Rue's back and kept it there. We breathed together, very slowly. Camp sign somewhere if they're still here. Could have moved on. Then why's the brush pile fresh? This isn't. The voice dropped and I lost the rest. They were on the ledge for about 20 minutes. They moved around. I heard them exploring the area to the left of the entrance, up the slope a little toward where the observation blind was. I heard boots on rock above me as at least one of them climbed the slope. I heard them talking in low enough voices that I couldn't follow the conversation. I heard what sounded like someone sitting down, the particular compression sound of a person settling their weight. Then nothing for about 5 minutes. Then one of them said, clearly, close enough that they must have been directly in front of the entrance, "Hello?" Just that. Not aggressive, not a demand, just the word. I did not respond. "If you're up here, we're not after your stuff. We've got a camp about 2 miles down. We've got food. We've got a doc who's patched up a few people. We're not..." A pause. "We're not going to take what you've got. We're just looking for more people." Still I didn't respond. Rue moved very slightly, and I pressed my hand down and she stilled. "We found boot prints. Size 9 or 10. Someone healthy from the stride. So you're okay from what we can tell. You've been here a while from the look of things, and you're smart. We couldn't find an entrance, and trust me, we looked." A pause. "We're going to leave. We'll be on this mountain for a couple more days. So if you change your mind, the CB frequency we're on is 40 channel." Footsteps moving away. More than one set. The crunch of the trail brush below the ledge. I pressed my back against the cave wall and my legs were shaking, though the rest of me was fairly controlled. I listened to them move down the trail until I couldn't hear them anymore. Then I waited another hour. Then I went to the entrance and looked out. The ledge was empty. They'd left something. on the flat rock where Rue sometimes slept in the afternoons. A can. A big can. The kind that holds a pound of coffee. I stared at it for a long time. Then I reached out carefully and brought it in. Maxwell House. Original blend. Full, sealed, original factory seal intact. I turned it over in my hands for a while. There was a piece of tape on the bottom with handwriting on it. Whoever you are, we're real, Kel and the others. I made coffee on day 71 for the first time since I'd used the last of Gerald Poole's instant packets on day 9. I made it on the small camp stove, using the folding pour-over filter I had, properly, with grounds and hot water. I sat on the floor of the cave with my back against the wall, and Rue leaning against my leg, and the cup of coffee in both hands. And I cried, which I hadn't done in 70 days. I want to be honest about that. The crying lasted about 10 minutes. Then I stopped and drank the coffee and thought about what to do with this information. What I had, a group of people, at least 3, possibly more, who had found signs of me on this mountain and who said they had a camp 2 miles below, who had left me coffee, who had said they weren't there to take what I had. What I didn't know, anything else about them, how many they were, what camp meant, a tent settlement, a fortified position, who was in charge, and what they wanted beyond collecting more survivors, whether Kel was the person who'd done most of the talking, or someone else, whether their doctor was actually useful. What I knew about myself, I'd been alone in a cave for 70 days. My radishes were doing well. I had Rue. My water system was solid. My food supply, thanks to the elk and the foraging and the growing, was manageable to around day 90 to 95. I hadn't been found. Functionally, they'd found signs, but not me, and they'd left. I did not get on Channel 40 that night. I thought about it for 3 days. Days 71, 72, 73. I went through every angle I could think of. What they wanted, what I needed, what the risk profile looked like, what the upside was. I was aware that this kind of extended analysis, applied to a decision that most people would make in about 30 seconds, was a feature of isolation. My thinking had gotten very methodical and slow in certain ways. Too much time for every consideration to get examined from 12 angles. On day 73, I picked up the CB. I didn't get on Channel 40. I listened to it. For about an hour, across the afternoon, into the evening. I heard them. Not all the time. They weren't transmitting constantly, but twice. Short exchanges, check-in style. A voice I recognized from the mountain, the one that had said hello at my entrance, and another voice I hadn't heard before. Rougher, shorter phrases. They sounded organized. They sounded like people who'd worked out a routine. I listened for 5 days without transmitting. On day 78, I keyed the mic. Just once. Just, still here. I clicked it off immediately. About 4 minutes later, we hear you, whenever you're ready. That's all. The voice from my entrance. I recognized it. I didn't respond again for 11 days. Here's what happened in those 11 days. Let me tell you about days 78 through 89, because they weren't just waiting days. Things were happening. The movement pattern I'd identified in the valley, where the infected seemed to be clearing out of Kettrick, continued and became more pronounced. By the end of day 80, I was seeing maybe 5 to 10 visible, infected in the town's visible area during any given observation session, compared to the 40 or 60 I'd been tracking in peak days. The highway was quieter still. There had been no vehicle movement since the convoy on day 29. Where were they going? My honest answer is I still don't know for certain, but on day 82, doing a careful 2-mile scout north along the ridgeline, the furthest I'd gone since the first weeks, I found something that helped me build a hypothesis. About 2 miles north, on the eastern slope below the ridgeline, there's a wide, shallow drainage that runs roughly east-west before it drops off the mountain. In normal times, it'd be a seasonal creek, barely worth noting. During my scout, I came to the edge of the drainage, and I stopped because Rue had gone from relaxed heel position to pointed nose and stiff tail, which was her "there's something big ahead" signal from prey-tracking instincts she'd never lost. I went slowly to the lip of the drainage and looked down. 20 to 30 infected, gathered in the drainage, not moving mostly. Some were in the stream itself, which was running low. Some were on the bank. None of them were reacting to anything. No stimulus present. So they were in that baseline dormantish state I'd observed before. Just there, in the drainage. Water. They'd gone to water. I sat with this for a long time. If the infected were congregating at water sources, which would be a form of, I don't know what you'd call it, not planning, not strategy. Something more like the biological drive that moves animals to water even when they're not consciously pursuing it. If that was happening, then the mountain's water sources were no longer reliably safe for me to approach. I went home. I told Rue she'd done a very good job, which she accepted with dignity. On the way back, I took a different route, staying well above the drainage, and I came around the south side of a rock formation I hadn't been past before, and I found something I hadn't expected. A camp. Not current. Abandoned, I thought, maybe 3 weeks to a month prior, based on the degradation of the materials. A fire ring, stone-built, with ash that had been rained on multiple times. 2 tent poles, but no tent material. Either it had blown away, or someone had taken it when they left. A food waste area that animals had been into. A piece of rope tied between 2 trees that had been used for hanging gear. And on the nearest tree, scored into the bark with a knife, the letters TGN, and below it, a number that was partially obscured by a weather stain, but looked like it might be 14 or 16. Someone had been on this mountain before the group that found me on day 70, possibly much earlier. The ash pattern in the fire ring, the weathering on the rope, the height of the grass growing up around the fire ring, I estimated 6 to 10 weeks prior, which would put it around day 40 to day 60 of my own stay. Who were they? TGN meant nothing to me. Could be initials, could be a group name, a location tag, a number code, 14 or 16, number of people, days at camp, a date. I have a theory. A theory I've never been able to confirm and probably never will. The hikers in Kettrick that I watched on day 29, the ones who'd been hiding successfully and came out when the convoy passed through and then had a very bad time of it. Some of them may have gotten out. The person who drove away, they could have come up the mountain, made it to the ridge, camped here, and then, what? Joined another group? Moved on? Something else? I set the question aside. Not enough information to answer it, and I was already managing enough open questions. I took a piece of the rope from the tree. It was in good shape still. You can always use rope. Day 85. Weather change. November had been cold but not brutal, with the rain periods I've mentioned and enough clear days to keep the solar panel doing useful work. On the morning of day 85, the sky had a particular quality to it that I recognized from years of outdoor work. That low, dull white uniform cloud cover, with a specific quality of light underneath it that means snow is coming, and means it in the next 12 to 24 hours. I spent the day on winter preparation. I'd been doing incremental prep since the first week, but this was the urgent version. Extra wood into the cave, as much dry wood as I could find and carry. Water containers topped up. The rain collection system reinforced for potential snow load. The entrance barrier thickened. Everything outside the cave that wasn't absolutely meant to stay outside brought in or secured under rock. The snow came that evening and snowed steadily for 2 days. About 8 inches at cave level, more on the upper slopes. The mountain went from the particular damp leaf smell of late fall to the almost smell-free quality of snow. And the sound changed too. Snow absorbs and deadens in a way that made the cave feel even more isolated than usual. Rue seemed to have opinions about the snow that were mixed. She'd go to the entrance, look at it, look at me, and then come back in and lie down with a put-upon air. We were in agreement. Day 87, in the snow. I climbed to the observation blind and looked down at the valley. It was different. Snow changes sight lines, and I couldn't see as far into Kettrick as I usually could because of the haze from the precipitation. But I could see the highway clearly, and I could see the east end of the valley road. And on the valley road, moving slowly, there was a vehicle. One. Moving east to west, toward a road that went south, away from the mountains, moving too slowly for an emergency. Moving, I thought, like someone navigating carefully in snow conditions, looking for something, or looking at something. It turned south and went out of my sight. Day 88. I got back on the CB. "Are you still on the mountain?" I asked. 3 minutes of silence. Then, most of us moved camp after the snow. "But I'm here. Kel, I'm here. You said you had a doctor." "Yes." "How many people are you with?" A pause. Not a suspicious pause. A pause like someone deciding how honest to be. 11 now. Was more. "What do you know about the valley?" Another pause. "We know enough." "Why?" "I saw a vehicle this morning. Going south on the valley road." "Yeah," something in the way she said it, not surprise. "You know whose it was?" Not a question, but she answered it. "Could be ours. Could be somebody else's. There's another group working this area. Different from us." "Different how?" The longest pause yet. "We should talk properly. Not on open channel." "I'm not ready for that yet." "Okay. No pressure in it. I'll be here." I put down the CB, sat with the static for a while, then turned it off. On day 92, the infected in the drainage 2 miles north were gone. I did a careful check from above, upwind, with Rue, from the ridge looking down, and the drainage was empty. Whatever had drawn them there, or whatever had drawn them somewhere else, I couldn't know. But the drainage was clear. Day 93. I made my final food inventory. It was the most detailed accounting I'd done since around day 25. What I found, I had, if careful, enough for approximately 12 more days at my current intake. Not starvation levels, but not comfortable either. I'd been supplementing continuously. The mushrooms, the radishes and mustard greens, the foraging runs. But the core stores were coming down to the last quarter. I could push it to 15 days with strict rationing. Maybe 18 if I was willing to have some genuinely bad days toward the end. Or I could start having a different conversation on the CB. Day 95. I made fire at the observation blind. A small fire. A different kind of thing than my cave fires. This one was meant to be seen. Not a big, obvious signal. A small, deliberate fire in the blind, where the smoke would disperse through the brush in a way that looked intentional to someone looking for it, but might look like a trick of light or a ground-level fog wisp to someone not looking. I sat at it for 20 minutes and then put it out. 2 hours later, Kel's voice on the CB. "We saw your fire." "I know." "Ready to talk?" I was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about the group you mentioned, the one that might have had the vehicle." She did. Took about 10 minutes. What she told me was this. There was a settlement forming in the southern valley, about 15 miles from Kettrick, centered on what had been an agricultural cooperative facility. A larger building, multiple outbuildings, well water, fenced perimeter. The group at the facility had started with maybe 30 people, now had, by Kel's estimate, closer to 120. 120 people. I thought about that number. "How do you know?" I asked. "We had someone go down. She went in and came back. Took her about a week." "And?" Another careful pause. "She said it was organized. Said they were doing okay in terms of food and water. Said there was a man running things, who everyone called Aldrich, who was, her word, efficient. But she didn't want to go back. She couldn't completely tell me why. She said the people there were, she said they were quiet, in a way that wasn't just discipline or rules. She said it felt wrong. I thought about that for a long time. "What's your plan?" I asked. "Stay on the mountain for now. Watch. We know where you are, roughly. We're giving you space because you've clearly been managing. But we'd want to know if you're interested in a closer arrangement." "Closer arrangement," I repeated. "This mountain feeds 6 of us comfortably right now. The snowpack means spring water will be good. There's game above the snow line. There's a possibility of making something workable up here. And if I say no, then you say no. We're not Aldrich." I put down the CB. I spent days 95 through 99 thinking about what she'd said. I want to be honest about the quality of that thinking. It wasn't clean. It went in circles. It had a lot of the same material in it that had been cycling through me since day 40. Before thoughts, people thoughts, the question of what workable meant and who got to define it. The woman who'd visited the facility and come back not wanting to return. The word efficient and the way Kel had said it. I thought about Diane, about my brother in Portland, about whether they were at a facility somewhere being efficient in ways that felt wrong, or whether they weren't anywhere. I thought about Gerald Poole in the second chamber, in the back alcove, with his pressed flat hands and his good rain pants, and his 5 days of supplies that had run out. I thought about the boot prints I'd made in the soft mud that had brought those people to my ledge on day 70. I thought about the coffee, the Maxwell house with Kel's handwriting on the tape, the specific kindness of leaving something you didn't have to leave. On the morning of day 100, I woke up before light and I lay in my sleeping bag on the cave floor with Rue's weight against my legs, and I looked at the entrance slit, where the stars were just visible, and then starting not to be visible as the sky lightened, and I made a decision. I was going outside, not to the observation blind, outside, all the way out and down, closer to the valley. I wanted to see the settlement with my own eyes through the 600mm. I wanted to form my own judgment, not based on someone else's account, about what was there. I prepared for 2 hours before I left, packed a careful kit, 3 days of food in case I needed to overnight somewhere, both water containers full, first aid kit, knife, the 600mm and a camera body, all the spare batteries I had. I dressed for the cold, the wool sweater, the good gloves, the rubber boots over extra socks. I left most of my supplies in the cave. I weighted the entrance stone barrier from inside with the heaviest remaining bin. I looked around the main chamber once, at what 12.5 weeks of careful habitation had built, and then I went out. It was cold. The snow had compacted to about 4 inches at cave level, and the air had that dry, crystalline quality of late November at elevation. No wind. The sky was the particular steel blue that precedes full dawn by about 20 minutes. I stood on the ledge outside the entrance for the first time in a real sense, not stepping just outside and back, but actually standing on it, and I looked out at the valley. Rue sat next to me. She looked at the valley too. I started down the mountain. Getting down took most of the morning. I wasn't hurrying and I was being careful about noise and sight lines. The trail I used was not the main trail. I went on the north slope, through the mixed conifer, using a route I'd mapped out on foraging runs, and that kept me well away from the drainage where I'd seen the infected. At about halfway down, I stopped and set up the 600mm on the tripod and did a long scan of everything I could see. The town of Kettrick was quiet, no movement at all on the visible areas. The main street I could see had the same abandoned car tableau as it had for weeks. I saw no infected. I saw no people. I packed up and went further down. At about 300 feet above the valley floor, I stopped again. I was in the tree line here, with good cover, and I had a clear sight line south to the agricultural facility Kel had described. I could see it. It was about 12 miles south by my rough estimation, which is a long way even through a 600mm, but I could make out a large main building, what looked like several outbuildings, what might have been a fence line or wall on the perimeter, smoke from at least 2 chimneys, and movement, people-shaped movement, at a distance that was too great to read individual behavior, but clear enough to know it was there. I sat in the snow against a tree trunk and watched through the lens for about 40 minutes. At that distance, I want to be careful about what I'm claiming to know, but here's what I thought I was seeing. The movement in the facility compound was organized in a way that, from a distance, looked almost grid-like, people moving in lines, not randomly. Not the way people in a free settlement, people who are surviving and building something together and making their own decisions about where to be and when. Not like that. More like structured, repetitive, the same people on what appeared to be fixed paths, at intervals that had a regularity to them. It might have been nothing. It might have been a work schedule, a shift system, perfectly rational organization of limited labor. That's the reasonable explanation. I want to put the reasonable explanation first. But Kel's friend had said the word quiet in a way that wasn't about discipline. And the woman who'd been there for a week had come back, not wanting to return, and hadn't been able to fully explain why. And I'd spent 100 days learning to read things at a distance that most people can't read because they haven't trained themselves to watch long enough. I watched for another 20 minutes, tried to count the people I could see, got to 11 and lost track. The movement was consistent enough that I was confident there were more than 11, just not in my sight lines. 120 people was the number Kel had given, from her source. I was still watching when something happened that I wasn't expecting. On the road that connected the facility to the broader valley road, the access road, maybe a mile long from what I could estimate, a vehicle appeared, coming from the facility, heading north, moving at a pace that suggested purpose, not urgency. A big vehicle, I thought a pickup or a large SUV. It turned onto the valley road heading north, coming in the general direction of Kettrick, coming in the general direction of the mountain. I packed up the lens fast, moved back up into the tree line, got above the road by about 200 feet, and found cover in a rock outcrop and settled in to watch. The vehicle came up the valley road and turned off at the junction that led toward Kettrick's east approach. I lost it behind the town's visible buildings. Then I picked it up again briefly. Glimpse of it moving slowly through the commercial area, on the main drag, the same stretch I'd been monitoring from above for months. Stopped. Stayed stopped for about 15 minutes. Then moved again, back the way it had come. I watched it go. There was a specific thing about how it moved through Kettrick that bothered me. It was slow and deliberate, in a way that I'd come to associate, from my months of watching, with people who were looking for something specific in a place they knew well. Not the cautious slow of navigating infected, which I'd seen early on and had a recognizable quality of alert, stop-and-go movement. This was methodical, like an inventory check, like someone confirming that something was still the way they'd left it. I went back up the mountain, straight up, no detours. I got back to the cave in the late afternoon. Rue met me at the entrance. She'd been inside, as I'd left her, and she did the happy-to-see-you thing for about 30 seconds, and then went back to her spot by the entrance barrier. I sat down on the floor of the main chamber, looked around at everything I'd built, the stone shelf with the organized supplies, the fire ring, the water system container, the growing bins with their scrubby radishes, the camera cases stacked neatly, the notebook on the shelf with 100 days of field notes in it. I thought about what I'd seen. Then I picked up the CB. Kel. Still here. Her voice was steady. She'd been waiting. Tell me something. Your friend who went to the facility. You said she came back not wanting to go back. Did she say anything specific? Any detail? Not the feeling. An actual detail. A pause. She said, Kel's voice shifted slightly, like she was working to remember something. She said there was a man on the perimeter with a clipboard, writing things down when people went in and out. She said the people going in and out looked at the clipboard man first before they moved. I stayed with that. And she couldn't leave when she wanted to, Kel added. She had to ask. They let her go, but she had to ask. I put the CB down. Didn't turn it off. Just set it on the rock shelf. Outside, the late light was going the particular amber and pink that mountain evenings go, before the temperature drops hard and everything goes blue. Through the slit of the entrance, I could see the first stars. The valley below was quiet in the way it had been quiet for weeks now. Here is what I keep thinking about. It's the thing I can't resolve. When you've been alone in a cave for 100 days, your sense of what's normal gets recalibrated. Things that would have seemed clearly wrong in October, someone with a clipboard keeping track of movement, become harder to evaluate. Is that control? Or is it logistics? When you have 120 people in a facility trying to survive, you need to know where people are. You need to track movement for safety reasons. A clipboard might mean nothing, or it might mean something. Kel was on the mountain with 11 people, smaller, less resources, more exposed. But her friend had come back, had been allowed to leave and had come back, and those were two separate decisions that both meant something. I thought about Aldrich and his efficiency. I thought about the people moving in their grid-like patterns. I thought about the woman who couldn't articulate what was wrong. And I thought about the vehicle going through Kettrick this morning, like someone running an inventory check. On something in the town that still mattered to them. On a resource, a supply, or something else. Or on whatever had happened to the survivors who used to shelter in that building on the south side of Main Street. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And that not knowing is where I'm living right now, on the evening of day 100, with Rue settling against my legs, and the cold coming in through the entrance slit, and the cave doing its particular acoustic settling sound around me. Here's what I do know. I survived 100 days because I was quiet, and I was careful, and I didn't trust things I couldn't verify. That's not paranoia. It's the same discipline that lets you photograph a mule deer at 30 feet, without it knowing you're there. You don't close the distance until you understand the animal. You don't assume it's safe, because it's been safe so far. You read the signs, and you wait for confidence, not comfort. Kel says stay on the mountain. 11 people, a doctor, the ridge system I know better than anyone. That's one option. Aldrich has 120 people and a facility, and a man with a clipboard. And then there's the third option that I haven't said out loud yet to anyone. Stay exactly where I am, alone with Rue, and keep watching. Keep gathering data. Keep being the thing that no one can see because no one is looking in the right place. The cave is cold tonight. I banked the fire earlier and it's down to coals now, throwing a low orange on the stone walls. Rue's breathing has the long, slow rhythm of deep sleep. The water drips in its particular pattern from the seep in the corner. The bats in the chimney crack have gone quiet. I have 3 days of food left from what I packed for today. I have the notes in my notebook. I have my camera and the 600mm and 100 days of knowledge about this mountain. Tomorrow I'm going to talk to Kel, properly, on the mountain, in person, for the first time. But right now, I'm going to sit here with the coals and think about the man with the clipboard, about what he was writing down, about why Kel's friend had to ask to leave, and whether they let her go was the beginning of a sentence or the end of one. There's something about the way the facility looks from 12 miles through a lens that I keep coming back to, the grid of the movement, the regularity of it. In 12 years of wildlife photography, the only time animals move in that kind of grid, at those kinds of intervals, with that kind of consistency, is when they're in an enclosure. Not because they want to, because the enclosure defines where they go. I turned off the CB, reached over and scratched Rue behind the ear. She shifted slightly in her sleep without waking. The fire put a long shadow on the ceiling of the cave, and I watched it for a long time, and I didn't go to sleep for a while. Tomorrow I'll talk to Kel. Tonight I'm still thinking about the man with the clipboard. Let me tell you a few things I left out that I want to get in before I close this out. The first is about what happened around day 80 with the passage in the cave. The sealed passage to the back system. Around day 80, during one of the cold nights, I heard the can alarm again. I'd rebuilt the pile at the crawlspace entrance from the main chamber side in such a way that the cans were now a redundant system. The bins and the stone were the primary barrier. The cans were just confirmation. What I heard at around 1 in the morning was one can, a single brief sound that could have been anything. An air pressure shift in the cave, an animal, the pile settling. I lay still for a long time. Rue didn't alert. She shifted once and then settled back. I never heard it again after that. Whatever had come through the back system on day 55, whatever had pushed through that gap and left blood and fiber on the rocks, either came back and couldn't get through what I'd built, or it moved on. I don't know which. I'd like to think the second one. What I do know is that when I was doing the foraging run north on day 82 and found the infected in the drainage, I was looking at them from above, and I was specifically looking at their hands and feet and heads. Looking for signs. Looking for markings or damage that would tell me something about the one that had come through the passage. I couldn't determine anything. They all showed damage of various kinds. Too many variables, too little information. The second thing is about the camera. Throughout everything, the 600mm telephoto was the tool that changed my understanding of this situation more than anything else I had. Every assessment I've made about the valley, about the infected, about the convoy, about the facility, about the vehicle this morning. All of it was through that lens. I've been asked before, in the old life, why I invested so much in optics when you could get good enough results with less expensive equipment. The answer is that distance is information. Being able to see clearly from a distance that keeps you safe is the thing that lets you make real decisions instead of guesses. I put my whole career's worth of equipment in a Pelican case and carried it up a mountain, and it told me more about how to survive than any other single thing I possessed. The third thing is about Gerald Poole. On day 98, I went into the second chamber, and I moved the bins away from the entrance to the back alcove, and I went back to where I'd left him at the beginning. I don't want to describe what was there. 98 days in a cold cave changes things significantly, but some things remain. I did something I should have done at the beginning. I took his notebook from his pack. I opened it to the last entry. Ankle. Worse. Staying in cave tonight. And I added a line below it, in my handwriting, dated as best I could, October 3, found. Known. His name was Gerald Poole. He made it to shelter. I put the notebook back in his pack, restacked the bins. I'm not going to tell you why I did that or what it meant to me, because I don't think I can explain it better than what it was. He'd made it to shelter. That seemed worth writing down. The fourth thing, and this is the one that's been with me all day since I came back from the valley, is about my brother in Portland. His name is Danny. He's 34. He would, in normal times, have been in the northeast of the city, in the neighborhood near the industrial district where he works in a small fabricating shop. He's good with metal and tools. He's the kind of person who is annoyingly practical, and who thinks of things before you think to ask for them. When we were kids, he was the one who packed the first aid kit when we went camping, and the one who remembered to tell Mom where we were going. I don't know if Danny is alive. I've spent 100 days not thinking about that during the designated times. I've done okay at it, mostly. Today I'm not doing as well. If Danny is alive, he's somewhere. And somewhere might be the facility with the man and the clipboard. Somewhere might be with a group like Kel's, on some mountain somewhere, watching from a distance. Somewhere might be a place I don't know about. Tomorrow I'm going to talk to Kel, in person, and I'm going to ask her what she knows about the areas north of us, and about Portland, and about whether any of the radio traffic she's been monitoring has given her any sense of what's happening in the big cities. That's the decision I've actually made, I realize. Not the one about the facility, not the one about staying or going. The decision is to stop operating solely on my own observation set. 100 days of data from one viewpoint, however careful, is still one viewpoint. The 600mm shows me everything in my sightline, but it also shows me only what's in my sightline. Danny would point that out. He'd say, "Owen, you know you can't see around corners, right?" And he'd be right, the way he was usually right about simple things I was overcomplicating. So tomorrow I'm going down the north side of the mountain toward where Kel has her camp, a 2-mile walk in the morning cold, and I'm going to meet 11 people I've never seen, and I'm going to listen to what they know, and I'm going to make some decisions with more information than I currently have. I'm going to bring Rue, obviously. I'm going to bring the 600mm, and I'm going to keep being careful, because 100 days of being careful is what got me to day 100, and I'm not leaving that behind because I found people. I'm bringing it with me. It's the most important thing I built in that cave, more than the water system or the entrance barrier or the growing bins. It's just not visible from the outside, which is why nobody found it. Right. That's day 100. The fire is coals now, and I'm going to let it go to ash tonight and not rebuild it until morning. The cave is cold and the stars outside are very clear, and Rue has moved her head onto my foot, which she does when she's decided I've been awake long enough. She's probably right. One more thing, then I'll stop. At the observation blind, when I was up there earlier in the morning before I went all the way down, when I was scanning the valley before I committed to going further, I moved the 600mm in a long, slow pan from left to right, the way I'd do it starting a wildlife documentation session. Old habit. Taking in the whole frame before you decide what you're actually watching. And at the edge of my pan, up on the northern ridgeline maybe 3 miles from where I was standing, I saw something that I've been putting off thinking about, because I don't know what to do with it. It was small. Could have been a deer. Could have been a large bird landing and then going. Could have been a trick of light on snow. But it looked, through the 600 millimeter, like a person standing at the ridge, alone, facing south, toward the valley, just standing there, not moving, not in any kind of distress that I could see, just standing and looking in the same direction I was looking from 2 miles closer. I watched the spot for about 4 minutes, and then it wasn't there anymore. I don't know what it was, but I thought about the camp I'd found, the TGN notation on the tree, the fire ring with the rained-on ash. I thought about the number, 14 or 16, carved below it, about someone surviving on this mountain before me, or alongside me in places I hadn't found. There are things on this mountain that I haven't seen yet. There are things in the valley I can only understand from this distance. There are things in the cities further north that I have no access to at all. 100 days in a cave is 100 days of looking in one direction from one angle. It's time to look in more of them. Rue yawns. Her yawn is extravagant. The full jaw stretch, the little sound at the end.